All right. What's up, everybody? I am here with David, and today we are going to be reviewing a video from Gavin Ortlund on, I guess, why theists or Christians shouldn't abandon the moral argument so readily. So, you'll see from the video, but basically, the moral argument has been this popular topic in online debate space and YouTube and all that stuff for a while, and it's been under enough heat that I think some Christians, some theists are starting to back off of the argument a bit. And I think his case is generally, hey, before you do that, there are some considerations to keep in mind that we can maybe prop up this argument and keep using it. And David wanted to review this with me. I'm sure we're going to have different things to say about it, but let's just get into it.
And maybe one other thing I should say from the start is that I was one of those Christians who used to use the moral argument because I was sort of taught this is a very powerful argument in the Christian apologist's arsenal. I'm still a Christian, still by some reckonings a Christian apologist, but this is one of the arguments I don't use anymore. So just so people have that background.
Okay, yeah, and that's an important thing to emphasize is that I'm coming at this stuff from an atheist perspective. I used to be a lot more of the religion is stupid and terrible and bad, and everyone that's religious is a dumb, ignorant idiot. And I used to have more of that vibe. I don't really have that vibe anymore. That came and went as I think in the atheist world, although there are vestiges of it that are still with us. But I
would have been the opposite extreme. There was probably a point where I was like, well, no, there can't be any reasonable atheists and stuff. And, you're in denial of Christianity or God's existence, then you must be such a, dumb, stupid idiot. And of course, we both, I guess, to some extent, come to more moderate positions.
Yeah, I still think I'm right, though. So, and I think that's okay. I just, I've met too many people that are nominally on my side, and then I hear them talk, and I'm like, oh my God, please shut up. And then I hear people on opposite sides or different sides or have different takes from me, and I'm just like that. I don't agree, but this person clearly knows their business. So,
yes,
the fiery youth of hostility towards everybody with different perspectives has tempered itself with time. All right. So, David, you've been on the channel before, recently. So this is round 2, I guess. But why don't you tell everybody here a bit about yourself, just in case, this is their first time seeing you.
Yeah. I'm just kind of an online personality. Nobody terribly special. I do kind of Christian theology, philosophy, apologetics sort of material. I have my own channel called Faith Because of Reason, where I do video essays on topics that are important to me, including one on the moral argument and why I don't accept it, which has been, kind of one of my more controversial videos. And presumably that's the reason why this video by Gavin was sent to me. And so, yeah, just here to talk about it with you.
All right. So why don't we just get started? I often just end up talking about whatever random stuff comes to mind. I'm very stream of thought, but we should just get into the video. Do let me know. I'll just kind of let it run. If there's any audio issues where the sound seems very imbalanced with our audio, please in the audience let us know. David, if you think it's too loud or too quiet, let me know, and then we'll just roll it. And let me know where you want to stop, and we'll take it from there.
Alrighty.
The moral argument is often regarded as the most effective argument for God's existence. But interestingly, a lot of theists have become more lukewarm about the moral argument, and some are abandoning it altogether. It's become kind of unpopular. And it's certainly true that in the popular level usage of this argument, there's a lot of naivety about meta-ethics, which is the field of study about the nature of ethics, as opposed to normative or applied ethics. We might get into that a bit. But this is a case where I'm worried about throwing out the baby with the bathwater. There are some really good moral arguments out there that I think we need to keep using and strengthening and rehabilitating as is necessary, rather than just abandon them. So in this video, let me give 2 reasons why we should be cautious about rejecting altogether moral arguments, and then 3 strategies for how we can do better at deploying them in our conversations and evangelism, apologetics, and so forth. And I'll conclude with a final example of a really cool moral argument from fiction. And yes, it's from C.S. Lewis. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I hope each video will serve you. I work really hard on them to try to make them, some of them are long and in-depth, but I try to make them organized, and so it's not a waste of your time. And the goal is that each video would sort of shepherd people toward the joy and the enchantment and the peace and assurance that comes from knowing Jesus. You can check out my website if you're more interested in some of the other things I do as well. So first, let's take 2 reasons why people should kind of tap the brakes a little bit before just throwing moral arguments away. Now, these are not reasons so much for an atheist to accept one of the moral arguments, more just reasons why theists should be careful before rejecting these. First, the intuition that morality points to God is very deep in the Judeo-Christian tradition, as well as in the other religions as well. In other words, if you're a Christian theist, for example, this is just a part of our heritage. You can think in more recent times of C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity. It's amazing to me that, it's got, initially it had these 3 books or sections to the book. And the entirety of book 1 was a moral argument. This is the only argument for God that he really gives, and it's one of the major 3 sections of the book. Now, some people say that moral arguments are only more recent arguments for God, beginning maybe with like Immanuel Kant, for example. But arguments from morality in general go back throughout church history. You can look back at Athenagoras, a Christian apologist back in the 2nd century, for example. He's arguing that if there is no divine judgment on our actions, then we're just like the animals and virtue is absurd. And he proceeds to argue that if there is a distinction between the fate of good and the fate of evil, it must be in the afterlife. And then he basically builds an argument from that to the resurrection. Or you can look all the way back in Scripture, and you find the Apostle Paul writing about in Romans chapter 2 that the moral law of God is written on the hearts of Gentiles. Now, this is not a syllogistic argument, but it supports the heart of all moral arguments, really, namely that the conscience points to God. And in this passage in Romans 2, Paul is assuming that our knowledge that we get from our conscience is relevant to what will be held accountable for on Judgment Day. In other words, Paul assumes that everybody, even if they don't have access to special revelation, like the written law of Moses or something like that, everyone has enough knowledge about God from our conscience that will be accountable for that on Judgment Day. That's an amazing assertion about the sort of revelatory nature of our conscience. Now, again, this doesn't mean that every moral argument is successful out there, but it does mean that I think for Christians, we should at least be sympathetic to this broad idea involved in moral argument. And that's kind of the burden behind this video as I've been coming back to study this topic more and more. If we were to abandon moral arguments altogether, this would constitute a major revision in kind of classical Christian thought. And it seems to me it would be kind of historically eccentric and strategically unwise. Think of an army that is abandoning a key hill on the battlefield from which they've made lots of successful attacks. And then they, without good reason, just abandon that hill. You'd kind of feel indignant, like, no, we shouldn't leave that. And that's kind of how I feel about moral arguments, even though they are often deployed poorly. In themselves, there's a lot there that can be harnessed and used to great effect, especially right now in our culture. Second reason why we should
Maybe that's a good point to stop at.
Especially if we're...
Sorry?
I would say maybe that's a good point to kind of dive in on some of the stuff there. Did you want to go first?
Nope, go for it.
Okay. So yeah, the analogy he uses here is, and I should say, I really do like Gavin. And I don't know if he would exactly consider me a friend. We are, Facebook friends, but I don't think we've had a whole lot of interaction. But I do like Gavin. I like the kind of demeanor he brings to these videos and things. And of course, I'm sure we both are going to be, very respectful of him, despite disagreeing with him throughout this video. But it's probably just helpful to say that this isn't coming from a place of any animosity towards him. So I guess the way he sees it is that the moral argument is this fortress, and that the Christian apologists like me who advocate against this argument are kind of abandoning the stronghold. That's kind of not the analogy that I would use, because it seems to me a lot more like this is a major kind of a weak point in Christian apologetics, and that we'd have a stronger case if we kind of just dropped it, because overall, if you're presenting a case for theism, for Christianity, and you make the moral argument a major pillar of that, because it seems to me it's so easy to knock that one down, that even if like the rest of your case is good, the fact that you've put so much weight on this one is at least going to give like a perception that major damage has been done to the case for Christianity. So the point he's making holds in reverse if the moral argument is actually not good. And so the point is which sort of perspective you take on it wholly depends on the moral argument actually being a good argument in the first place. And so, yeah, I mean, we'll talk about that. So his point here is he says that there's this intuition that morality points to God, and that's kind of his first reason that, you know, not necessarily that you shouldn't abandon the moral argument, but that you should, I guess, be cautious about abandoning it. And I mean, I guess I'm fine with that. You know, I approach the issue with caution. I mean, it wasn't an argument I gave up overnight either. I had to, you know, think about it and do a lot of reading on it and see, you know, who are the best defenders of this argument before I finally, you know, just came to the point that there's not a version of this argument that I could, you know, confidently defend. So I guess one thing to say in response is, though, that to maybe cancel this out is you'd have equally strong intuitions on the other side, right? You have many people who just find it very strange that, you know, given moral realism, that this would in any way imply theism, because, you know, moral realism, that the whole point of it is that, you know, moral facts are not supposed to depend on the, you know, volition of beings, or they're not supposed to depend on a mind, right? Or at least on a stance. So I think the divine command theory, which is usually what defenders of the moral argument hold to, not all of them, to many people, it seems very antithetical to moral realism. And so for a lot of people, the intuition goes exactly the other way. So I don't really know how strong of a point that is on its own. He points to some people in, you know, Christian history who have thought that morality points to God. And I mean, yeah, that tradition's there. I don't know if it's like he says, oh, this is a major deviation. I mean, moral arguments for theism, he's right. They do turn up, you know, periodically in some, you know, historic Christian thinkers, but it's certainly not like across the board. You can find plenty of Christian thinkers in history who I don't know that we could find them explicitly rejecting moral arguments, but, you know, it certainly is not like a staple that's present in all of them. So I don't know that it's like this major deviation from Christianity, like he kind of suggests, to say that, you know, to reject moral arguments. It just seems like you would be maybe in like a different tradition of Christian philosophers, maybe like myself. I'm very Cartesian in my approach. You know, Descartes is not making moral arguments for God's existence. So, yeah, I don't know that it's a major deviation. You'd probably just put yourself sort of in a different lane of Christian thought if you're departing from moral arguments. Last point I'll make is he kind of makes an appeal to the Bible, where Paul says the law of God is written on people's hearts. He adds something there, and I don't know that he's doing this consciously, because I see a lot of Christian apologists do this, but they say Paul says that God's moral law is written on our heart, and it simply doesn't say that anywhere in the text. It nowhere says that this is a moral law. It just says that the law of God is written on people's hearts, which I think he's correctly interpreting that as a reference to people's conscience. But there's no reason you have to interpret that as a moral law, certainly not as a moral realist law, right? In the last video we did, I explained my own sort of take on this, is that laws that God gives us, they're just, you can understand that as being sort of analogous to just federal laws that we have. There's no reason to interpret these as sort of realist moral laws. So I don't think that argument or that reason he's suggesting really gives you a great reason to think that moral arguments are found in Scripture.
Yeah, so one of the things that puzzled me about a lot of his presentation here is that I don't recall any explicit reference in any of this setup to moral realism, and yet I've understood moral arguments to be appealing to the presumptive fact that something like moral realism is true, and that moral realism requires or depends in some way on the existence of a God to argue that therefore there's a God. But stuff like the moral law, like even if you said the moral law is in some way instilled in us or written on our hearts or something like that, arguing from morality to God. Well, what do you mean? What about morality? The fact that morality is objective or stands independently true, or the fact that all over the world, wherever we look, people have an innate predisposition to think about morality in particular sorts of terms or ways. I don't actually think that that's true, but uh, in the latter case, if you did think that, like if you make a case like this, you know, everywhere we look, regardless of culture, history, education, experience, the point of time you're looking at anything, uh, people seem to have this conscience, and that conscience, you might say things like, it doesn't really seem to fit with a naturalistic or evolutionary explanation, perhaps, or it calls for some sort of explanation. We need some kind of explanation for why we would all share this capacity for thinking in moral terms and having a conscience and having a sense of like compassion or kindness or love or something like that. Hey, that points to God. Well, what does that have to do with moral realism? That would be like a claim that would be closer to pointing to something about human psychology or human faculties or capacities, to say, hey, there, you know, you could have some sort of abductive argument that says, well, what explains that? And you know, the naturalist or the atheist might say, well, we can give an evolutionary explanation or we could give some cultural explanation, but a Christian or a theist might say, hey, or maybe God made us. And that explains that. So that kind of argument, is that a moral argument? Like, because it's not about meta ethics. So what do you, I don't know enough about like historically construed moral arguments, whether they're all about meta ethics or whether there are, you know, quote unquote moral arguments that are not really construed in meta ethical terms.
Yeah, I think a lot of the tradition that he's appealing to is just not sensitive to a lot of sort of somewhat modern developments in the field of metaethics. So I think that's sort of one thing we've been seeing with like sort of modern Christian analytic philosophy, is that there's been a lot more sort of sensitivity to those sorts of distinctions that you're making there. And they are important distinctions, because obviously when we start asking the question specifically, what about morality, is, you know, pointing to theism. In general, at least, you know, any defense of a moral argument that I've seen, it appeals to, you know, the sort of moral realist and generally moral non-naturalist nature of morality. And this kind of goes back to, I think, a sort of simplistic binary I touched on in our last video, which is that there's this sort of view that it's like theism or like this strict naturalistic materialism. And so if you kind of get moral non-naturalism, then, you know, it can't be naturalistic materialism, so it has to be theism, right? And of course, that's just a false dichotomy. You've got all kinds of logical space in between those two extremes. I think that is doing some work, though, in a lot of these typical moral arguments.
Yeah, but you know, the other thing I worry about is a kind of anachronism in the way that Christians, and I think that this happens in analytic philosophy more broadly, look back on the history of philosophy, on the history of Christian theology. I don't have the scholarly or historical background to make judgment calls on any specific case. Like, I just don't have that background. But it does worry me when people say things like, you know, moral arguments have been a part of the Christian tradition, and it would be a huge deviation to not rely on them. If moral arguments are understood as bearing some semblance to like the William Lane Craig version, like it's like this standard modus tollens that appeals directly to the existence of stance independent moral facts, to some type of moral realism. You know, is that implied by Paul in the scripture? It doesn't look like that to me. Is that implied by like early church figures? Maybe, I don't know, because they read philosophy and they had some awareness of, you know, like Greek philosophy, which did have stuff that's in the ballpark of contemporary analytic philosophy, which of course is an extension on and a development on Western philosophical tradition. So maybe some of them did, but I do worry that, you know, we have this tendency, you know, since, you know, G.E. Moore and the modern incarnation of contemporary analytic metaethics, to construe and frame metaethics in a particular way. Like, here's our categories, here's the positions. And then people get that internalized so much that they project that back onto the way everybody else thought prior to, you know, the early 1900s. And I'm just not sure how accurate those projections are. Like, they might be accurate, they might not be. I don't know. And what I'm not seeing from people that make these sorts of claims is that they, convincingly show, yeah, there's a good case to be made, even though they didn't speak in the same way or frame things using the same terminology, that they plausibly did think in the same way that we do today. I haven't seen a case for that. Maybe that's somewhere in some book I don't know about. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that before we continue?
Well, yeah. A lot of it is people in the past just didn't necessarily have as finely grained a conceptual scheme of these sorts of things as somebody reading sort of contemporary metaethics would have. The other thing too is, well, I think a lot of people who are making the moral argument, and I'm not talking about everyone. I mean, there are people like C. Stephen Evans, David Baguette. They obviously understand it, but like a lot of people, honestly, even William Lane Craig, I go out on a limb and say this in his case. I'm not sure how sensitive they are to a lot of these distinctions in metaethics. Because Craig is obviously, he's a very smart guy, but he also doesn't specialize in the field of metaethics. So, obviously not being familiar with some things here and there would be completely understandable. But I'm just not sure how sort of well a lot of people who are making the moral argument themselves understand some of the distinctions in metaethics. Because, almost everyone, and even Craig himself is guilty of this, they want to make it this sort of competition between, moral realism and like the most simplistic sort of relativism. I think it's called agent relativism, if I'm not mistaken. And they want to make it a competition between those two things, and they're like, well, either you think that it's really stamped independently wrong for you to torture babies for fun, or you have to admit that, it's just your opinion and anyone else's opinion is just as good. And so I think I'm probably going off a little bit of a tangent here, but there does seem, I think, among proponents of the moral argument themselves to sort of not even be sort of familiar with the full range of metaethical options that are out there, particularly the resources that are open to people who are not moral realists. Like moral anti-realists don't have to be agent relativists. So you've got, I think, confusion there on the part of proponents of the moral argument themselves. And I'm not saying Gavin himself is necessarily guilty of this. I haven't heard Gavin talk about this enough to know to what extent he understands the sort of contemporary landscape in metaethics. But certainly for a lot of people, it's very easy to see how they could be making these sorts of mistakes, projecting these categories back onto perhaps historical writers who probably didn't even have, a clearly defined concept of stance independence, because it's just that wasn't how the logical space was carved up back in the day. So it's easy to see that if people in the modern era themselves aren't really clearly understanding contemporary metaethics, but are just maybe adopting certain terms, then it's easier to see how they could be projecting that back into the past.
That makes sense. Before we move on, would you want to address some of the comments that we've got? Some of them are directly relevant to what's been said here.
Yeah, it's your
we
show.
Don't have to address them. Okay, so here's one from Blentasticful that says, and I'm just curious about your position in this. Christians put way too much emphasis on C.S. Lewis. They don't realize that he's only a convincing authority to people who already believe. It gets tiring. What do you think about that?
I have to be honest, that question really, or that comment does resonate with me a lot. There is almost this religious reverence for C.S. Lewis among Christian, even good Christian apologists, like David Baguette and Jerry Walls, for example, are probably two of the better defenders of a contemporary moral argument. And even in their books, they begin with this discussion of C.S. Lewis. And so there almost seems to be this real deference to Lewis. And I love Lewis, right? I've been reading C.S. Lewis since I was 7 years old. I read Mere Christianity. That was that was probably my first time I actually read a moral argument. And of course I found it, convincing at the time. I do agree, though. C.S. Lewis he's a great writer. I love to read C.S. Lewis because he's unique and he's interesting to read. But as an academic, Lewis, I probably get some hate from some of my Christian friends for this. C.S. Lewis is not the most rigorous academic out there. And so just because, he maybe eloquently words certain ideas from within a moral argument, because he's eminently quotable, that doesn't mean that what he's saying can necessarily be defended with philosophical rigor. And so that's kind of, I do generally agree with that quotation. I think there are a sizable contingent of defenders of moral arguments, including, sadly, even like some of the academic defenders, who give an undue level of reverence or at least deference to C.S. Lewis that he hasn't necessarily earned. Again, I love reading C.S. Lewis. He's a great writer, but you have to be able to separate that from, is what Lewis is saying true? Is it well defended? Can it actually be put through any sort of scrutiny? Or is he also operating on this sort of simplistic binary that is all too common in contemporary Christian apologetics? So yeah, that's what I would say to that.
Okay, and we got one more also from Blantastic Full. How about we don't just stubbornly hold propositions just because they were held in Christian history in the first place?
So I think Gavin would be the first one to say that, yes, if you're not a Christian, of course, you're going to take that position. So I think he was careful to say that this is more this is a more point to consider for someone like myself who is a Christian, but doesn't hold to a moral argument, or maybe even someone who's just thinking about rejecting it. And I mean, I'm fine with him raising this point. I don't think we should hold to a proposition just because it was, widely held in Christian history. On the other hand, as a Christian, I do believe in some sense that God is, guiding the church, right? That there are truths there. That God is not going to let the truth be completely lost. So I, as a Christian, would want to be cautious about rejecting something if it were very widely held by Christians. I don't necessarily agree with Gavin that moral arguments have been that widely held in church history. I mean, I think he only gave, well, if we're including the Apostle Paul, I guess he gave 3 examples. But that's certainly not, enough to, and I mean, I don't even grant the example with Paul. So that gives us 2 examples, and, that's not anything like enough to establish that this is a widely held proposition among, Christians historically.
All right, let's keep going. You ready?
Ready.
All right.
If we're Christians, or for many theists, this would apply as well, is that in contemporary academic philosophy, the moral argument is still defended by many high-level philosophers, and it's also taken seriously by many of those who reject it. And I'm pointing this out, even though it's a very modest point, because you'll sometimes hear the claim that no philosophers really take moral arguments seriously anymore. In sophisticated philosophical discussions, we've moved beyond that kind of thing, that mentality. You'll hear that out there. But there are great philosophers who affirm various kinds of moral arguments. An important figure in this area seems to be Robert Adams, and in particular, this book. Full disclosure, I have not read that book. I've read other things from Adams, but I've read enough portions of it and sections from it that I have some sense of what he's about. It's very highly spoken of, and it's on my to-read list. Alistair McGrath, Graham Ward, William Alston, C. Stephen Evans. These are examples of contemporary philosophers who defend this argument. Alvin Plantinga is a very good philosopher. He takes moral arguments very seriously. In fact, if you read this fascinating book that I talk about a lot, 24 or so Arguments for God, which Plantinga inspired, David Baggett, who is another great defender of moral arguments, begins his whole chapter in here on an abductive moral argument, pointing out basically that Plantinga considered a particular moral argument for moral obligation to be the best argument in the whole lot, which is kind of amazing. Other good defenses of the moral argument can be found in this book. I don't have it with me right now. It's called Good God by, again, David Baggett and Jerry Walls. Fantastic book. The one I did happen to put next to me here is called Divine Love Theory. This is by Adam Johnson, and he's done various debates on the moral argument as well. He has really good defenses against some of the most current objections, so check out his work. Of course, William Lane Craig, one of the great Christian philosophers of our time, has very capably defended moral arguments in various debates. This would be a great debate to watch as one example. It's with Eric Wielenberg. So that brings me to this other point, that a lot of the best philosophers who reject moral arguments still take.
So, sorry, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll just mention, and maybe you'll say something about this. If anybody was saying no contemporary philosophers take the moral argument seriously, that would be an overstatement. That would be a silly claim to make. But if they said something like the vast majority of contemporary analytic philosophers publishing in like conventional mainstream academic journals would reject the moral argument, that I would bet money on. I don't know if there's like specifically any research on that. I mean, most of them are atheists, but they're not just atheists. Just that most of them would just take like the kind of premise like if God doesn't exist, then objective moral values and duties don't exist, something like that. I don't think they would take it seriously. And yeah, it would be a very small minority position of working analytic philosophers that would take a stance like that. And I have the impression that he mostly chose philosophers that are involved or adjacent to or heavily invested in many cases in Christian apologetics. And I wouldn't consider them to be especially representative of the contemporary philosophical like mainstream landscape. And that isn't to say that I put much stock in what contemporary mainstream philosophers have to say. I mean, a lot of my work focuses on why we shouldn't accept their expertise or bow to their authority. So I'm not saying we should rely on mainstream analytic philosophy as some sort of like really authoritative source. But, it's easy to take a really extreme version of a claim. No contemporary philosophers think this and say, well, that's not true. Here's a list of people that do take it seriously. But I think it would also be a mistake to say, hey, I can find a list of people that take this seriously and they're good philosophers. So therefore, this is like a part of contemporary philosophy. A lot of the people that he mentions, it's not so clear, how much they are engaged with or are involved in contemporary analytic metaethics. I don't know that like, for instance, William Lane Craig would publish in the sort of standard journals where you would see. I mean, you do have Christians publishing there. You have Terence Cuneo. You do have other people that are publishing this kind of work. But like, when we're talking like Finlay, Joyce, Case, a lot of the people that are publishing right now, Nathan Nobis, who else? I'm trying to think of other people off the top of my head that are doing this work. David Enoch, Mike Humer. Even if some of them are Christians or theists, I don't know if any of them would take the moral argument to be a good argument. But I don't know what your thoughts were.
Yeah, and a lot of the people he is citing, like you said, are just not particularly experts in metaethics. You could argue maybe that's a perk because a lot of them are philosophers of religion, and so maybe they're better at identifying the links there. What I'd say in response, well, let me begin by differentiating between. There's two things that Gavin could be using this to support. One of them I would agree with, and one of them I would not. He could be saying, don't be too quick to reject a moral argument, because you've heard it's got problems or whatever, because look, here are some experts, some very good philosophers who think it's defensible. If that's all he's saying, then I would agree, right? If there are generally good thinkers who are defending a position, I'm probably going to be a little bit slower to reject it than I otherwise would be, because generally before I take like a firm position on any issue, I like to make sure that I've, consulted the best voices on the other side. On the other hand, perhaps he means that this is a reason for you, not to say it's a bad argument, right? It's a bad argument, or you shouldn't say it's an unsuccessful argument because look, there are good people defending it. That I flatly disagree with, right? And I can name you people, Christians, on the exact opposite side of that, people who are just as big of heavy hitters, right? Richard Swinburne, for example, is probably maybe he could be rivaled by Plantinga, but certainly than any of the other names he suggested, Richard Swinburne is going to be far more esteemed. He has openly said that he doesn't think that there's any way to get to the existence of God from the existence of moral facts and obligations. Mark Murphy is one of like the better. I think he's a Catholic ethicist out there, but he doesn't think that you can use a moral argument. And even though his own theory of morality is theistic, he doesn't think it has apologetic value. So, I mean, I can name you heavy hitters who are Christians who fall on the opposite side of this, and I think that's just going to cancel out what he says. And then I'm a details person. I like to get into the details and not like say, hey, can we name more people who agree with this than not? I have read, I think, every single one of the books and authors he recommended. I go through it in my video on the moral argument. I go through it in considerable detail, and they're just not good. I mean, he mentioned Adam Johnson, for example. Like, Johnson goes on for pages and pages trying to give reasons why a divine command, or his own like divine love theory, which is like a sort of co-opted divine command theory, is a better explanation for moral realism than like he uses Eric Wielenberg as his chief interlocutor. And it's just it seems to me like it's patently irrelevant stuff he's bringing up. It's stuff like, well, I have an exemplar in my theory, right? I've got a perfect exemplar of how to be moral in my theory, and so that's why it's a better theory than Wielenberg's. And I'm like, yeah, I'll grant you have that in your theory. You've packed it in. But I don't see why that's a perk for a moral theory to have. I certainly don't see why it's necessary for a moral theory to have that. So, yeah, I mean, when you get into the details, which I've tried to do, I don't think that the actual reasons any of these philosophers he's citing give to prefer, a theistic explanation for morality is good. And that's assuming moral realism in the first place, which I know you have a whole big hang up about even granting that.
Yeah, I also have hangups about some of the things I've seen. I haven't read these books, but I've seen William Lane Craig, for instance, in debates, make a case for moral realism, and it's really weak. Like, one of the things he'll say is just, we experience morality, in this way that suggests that there's this realm of stance independent moral facts. Now, this is a claim that a lot of secular moral realists make, and that is frequently made in mainstream analytic philosophy. The argument for moral experience. Don Loeb has a good paper critiquing this, which is worth checking out. But it looks like William Lane Craig looked at some of the work there and employs that. But that, I don't even care if most analytic philosophers think there's a good case for that. There isn't. When they start making claims about our moral experience is in such and such a way, they enter the realm of psychology. And, I have this slogan, I haven't said it on a while on the channel, but, one of the things I like to say is that a lot of philosophy is bad psychology. It's psychology with a sample size of 1. Now, that's a bit tongue in cheek. I don't actually mean it. It's not like philosophers just go, how do I think? Everybody thinks like me. But they might talk to their colleagues or talk to people in their, they have anecdotal experience. Anecdotal experience is not sufficient to establish claims about universal aspects of human experience and phenomenology. It's not good enough. If it were good enough, we would not need the field of experimental psychology to try to understand human personality and human behavior and human cognition. We could just talk to people around us, and then we would know all about psychology. Now, if anyone spends any time studying psychology really rigorously, what you'll discover is that human beings are incredibly complex and messy, and it's very, very difficult to understand human psychology. It is incredibly difficult to understand human psychology when you have, the resources to do research on thousands of people at a time, because there's so much variation. There's so many issues with measurement and validity and difficulties, trying to operationalize this or that construct. It's not the case, unlike, look, every field has its challenges, and it's not a competition to say, whether physics or psychology or chemistry or biology is more difficult. They all have big challenges. Like astronomy, we're dealing with trying to figure things out about objects that are, light years away from us. And the things astronomers are able to achieve in spite of that fact are extraordinary. One of the things psychology is dealing with is the fact that much of what we study is not directly observable. We cannot look at it. At least astronomers can look at a star. I can't look at a belief. I can't look at a desire. We have to infer the presence of, latent variables, latent psychological phenomena have to be inferred from observations of behavior and what people say when you ask them questions. And so it all has to be mediated through language, and it all has to be interpreted. And so there is extraordinary capacity for bias to enter into that. And so, when a philosopher goes around saying, we experience morality this way, How do they know that? They didn't do the research to find that out. And, academic philosophers make these sorts of claims too. We think this way. We speak this way. So we speak this way. We do. Who's we? English speakers in 2025? I mean, they don't, it's not like, you might think, oh, these philosophers are so rigorous. There are over 7,000 languages in the world. There were thousands more languages all throughout human history. Are they making and a lot of their inferences are based off of their analysis of how people speak English currently. And they generalize from how people currently speak English to how everyone everywhere, all throughout time and history in the whole universe, thinks. That's ridiculous. Psychologists routinely get it wrong when they're working within Western civilization. And that's not even accounting for the fact that if you look at stuff like Hinnerkine and Norenzayan's The Weirdest People in the World paper, we actually have data on what kind of data we have. Like, how often do psychologists do this kind of cross-culture research? And the answer is barely ever. And they certainly are not reaching cultures around the world. So do people all throughout history and in parts of the world we haven't done this research experience morality the way William Lane Craig does? I don't know, and neither does Craig. So, it's pretty frustrating to see them, the arguments for for the moral argument are, to the extent that they rely on a premise that appeals to the truth of moral realism, are only going to be as strong as the case for moral realism. And when someone like Craig or, another apologist will say things like, we experience morality this way, or everyone finds, moral realism intuitive, they're making psychological claims that have no basis in evidential support in the actual empirical literature. And they're taking a lot of their cues from academic philosophers that I don't think that they're credible authorities on these matters either. They're not psychologists. So rant off, I guess, but it's pretty frustrating to see that the little glimpses I see of their cases for moral realism often appeal to highly dubious claims.
It's interesting to me how you and me will go after an argument like that in completely different ways. I don't disagree with anything that you said there. The way I would go after this is, first, I just want to ask, what the heck is a moral experience? I mean, like what are the characteristics, the features of an experience that make it specifically a moral one? And I don't typically get a very good answer to that question. And why this is important is because I want people, like, particularly like the Craig bots that I deal with in Reasonable Faith page, the people who just regurgitate whatever William Lane Craig says like it's the gospel truth. I want them to actually think about, what are you using as evidence for moral realism here? Because most of them have never even thought about what are the characteristics of a moral experience. When I reflect on an experience, I can't pick out any distinctly moral properties. And this is kind of one of the things where I really began my shift away from moral realism myself, was this is when I would reflect on experiences, which I've been told we have these moral experiences. And I thought, what would the difference be between let's say a paradigm example, right? Torturing babies for fun is the one they want to use. Allegedly this would be a moral experience of badness, I guess. And I had to ask myself, what would the difference be between, this experience if I just strongly disliked that? I had a really strong stance of dislike for, torturing babies for fun, versus if there's actually a moral fact present here. I couldn't pick up anything. The experience was fully consistent with my just having this stance of, revulsion towards this. I don't pick up any distinct moral property. I can't locate anything in the experience that is a moral fact. So I'm just very suspicious of this appeal to moral experience, even from the perspective of the person saying it. And of course, then you can go further and say that there's not even evidence that say that they can. So I guess think of this as a multi-stage challenge for people who want to make an appeal to moral experience. One, tell me what the heck a moral experience is supposed to be. Most can't get past that. Two, if you can get characteristics, what exactly in the phenomenology of your experience are you picking out as the moral fact that you're experiencing? Three, this is the point you were raising, is can you show that this generalizes to most people? And then kind of the final point that doesn't get brought up that much would be, even if you could show psychologically, by empirical data, that most people have these sorts of experiences, we need some reason to think that's veridical, right? Even just because most people, hold a belief or, have this sort of reaction, that doesn't actually show me that that's tracking anything real. So that's, I guess, the sort of four-pronged response I would make to someone who wants to appeal to moral experiences. I know we're way off from Gavin's argument at this point, but
this is I think it's relevant. It can be tangential, but it's still relevant. I would actually agree with the first couple steps that you outlined there. And, ironically, you mentioned that we approach this in different ways, but I think it was my last video was a response to someone that talked about morality having been evolved. And I addressed those first 2 points in that video. And, this is a big part of the psychological research that interests me. So, you may not be familiar with this, or people in the audience may not, but there's people that work on like the question of how do we delineate moral norms from non-moral norms. And there's been both approaches in philosophy and approaches in psychology. And I could make a couple recommendations for people. There's this great volume that came out, I think in 2018. So it's fairly recent, called The Atlas of Moral Psychology. I think the editor is Kurt Gray, is a prominent contemporary moral psychologist. There's 2 articles in there. There's a lot of articles. I read the whole thing and I loved all of it. I don't remember half of it probably, but there's a couple articles really stood out to me as really, really great. One is Stephen Stitch has an article called The Moral Domain. And he's like, all right, well, what is the moral domain? He goes, nothing. There isn't a moral domain. And so he actually argues that there's nothing that distinguishes moral from non-moral judgments. We lexicalize the term morality. And we may be able to look, it wouldn't be complicated for you or I if I gave you a list of things like punching someone in the face or stealing money from people just to go on an expensive vacation, something like that. I'm like, hey, are those moral things? I think you would be like, yeah, those are moral issues. And then if I said something like painting the wall in your room a light shade of green, not really a moral issue. Or adding up, doing math. Someone's in their room doing algebra, not really a moral issue. And so, there is a tendency for some of us to be able to consistently, like you and I, if we were asked to judge, like to box things as moral or not moral, there'd be a lot of convergence there. There wouldn't be zero correlation. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so.
But, is there any distinctive set of characteristics that we could use to distinguish the moral things from the non-moral things? Well, psychologists have set their efforts on trying to figure out what those might be. And there are populations that pretty consistently, using a particular set of empirical tools, will draw these sorts of distinctions, but they're not culturally universal. And those distinctions break down when you start adding different types of stimuli. And I talked about that in that video. The other paper in there is called Morality, a Historical Invention, where Edouard Machery argues that the concept of morality is a sort of legacy of a particular cultural influences. It's not this sort of thing that everyone everywhere has distinctively moral thoughts and moral concepts and thinks in moral terms. You can operationalize morality and say, well, a moral system is any system that a group of social organisms employ to facilitate cooperation and minimize conflict. Okay, fine. Then all human societies have moral systems. But that doesn't mean that they would think of their own practices as moral, like as if that were this essential, fundamental thing. And so, there is work in psychology that challenges this. And there are philosophers and psychologists that have raised concerns about what it would even mean to have a distinctively moral experience as opposed to some other type of experience. And I do think that research is really, really important because that is out there. And a lot of the people that would say stuff like we have moral experiences, who's we? Who is we? And how do they know this? And what is this based on? But the thing is, they never even get past your first 2 steps because they don't even, it's unclear what they would even say if asked about these questions. But to the extent that I've seen people try to answer them, I don't find the answers to be very good at all. Like they're deeply unsatisfying. And, if you can't even get past the first hurdle, how are you going to get past all 4?
Right. Yeah. It's usually just this sort of when I ask somebody if you could just tell me what do you even mean by a moral experience, it's usually just a fairly incredulous sort of response.
Yep.
Oh, you don't experience it as wrong when you see a baby being tortured for fun or something like that. And you're missing the point, right? It's not that I don't have the appropriate reaction or whatever to that. It's not like you don't have to try to paint me as a horrible person. I'm just trying to ask the philosophical question to get a precise understanding of what it is you're talking about. It's not about whether I'm having the appropriate reaction to the particular stimuli. But yes, that's interesting that there's
these conflations. Oh, sorry. Yeah, these conflations are super common. You know, I thought it was funny that you ended by mentioning that people give it an incredulous look. Stephen Stitch at the end of that article I just mentioned, the moral domain, says something like, you know, a lot of people, when I bring this issue up, he says a lot of people, when he makes this point or makes the, you know, presents this position, they give him an incredulous stare. They're just like, so he actually uses the language of incredulity in that article, because that is the reaction a lot of people have. And, you know, often, you know, it'd be one thing to be incredulous. And then, you know, for me, I would hope, I'm not saying this would necessarily be the case, to then become curious. Oh, wow, you think something very different. Why? But a lot of the incredulity, I think people are not appreciating. Like, it something seems obvious to them, and so it's got to be true. That's when has history ever played out that way? That whenever something seems super obvious to you, it's got to be the case. There are differences between certain sorts of considerations where that may be more plausible, and other sorts of considerations that might be up for challenge. And I think people should be open to considering whether some of the things that seem obvious to them might not be true.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, there is a genuine, like, sometimes I've had this happen, like when I'm in conversation with people and like they are like, you know, maybe very finely parsing out distinctions that like I haven't necessarily gotten my mind around, right? Whether just because I'm stupid or because I haven't, you know, given sufficient attention to the topic. And so like it can be difficult, like if somebody has, you know, thought about an issue and is like making finer distinctions. But yes, kind of like the I don't know, there's like this natural reaction, I guess, at least that I have, to respond to that with trying to dismiss it as nonsense. And sometimes that can be the case. I feel pretty confident in saying this with, you know, some of the debates I have with like my Thomistic friends. I think some of the like distinctions that they're trying to draw, it's straight nonsense. But I mean, there are times where like sometimes you do just have to get out of your maybe grid of thinking about these things and you know, actually take some time to become more educated on it to appreciate the person's point.
Yeah. All right. We've spent a long time paused on this point, so I think we should move on with the video.
Okay.
You ready?
Ready.
Don't take them seriously. They don't have a kind of condescending, dismissive attitude toward them. Eric Wielenberg is a fantastic philosopher. That's the person that Craig debated there in that debate I just mentioned. And he still recognizes that there are challenging arguments against secular morality, that even if he thinks they're not successful, they need to be taken seriously. In this passage from one of his books, he speaks highly, particularly of Craig and also of the Adams text that I just mentioned. And then, of course, if we were to go back in history, we could find some major players. I've already mentioned Immanuel Kant, but John Henry Newman is actually another fascinating theologian who's has a lot of insights into the nature of morality. Now, there's a lot more examples. I'm really trying to make a very modest point right now. I'm not saying that moral arguments are good or successful. I'm just saying don't let people browbeat you into thinking that this is a silly argument, that sophisticated philosophy has moved beyond. Okay, not at all. But in fairness, it can be handled very clumsily. Okay, so if we're not going to abandon moral arguments, what's the best way to deploy them right now?
Maybe we should say
I'll give 3 suggestions, hoping this is
moves on to that point.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a ton to say about this point. If he's always trying to do is establish that, which is kind of what he said he's trying to do for this particular point, is just establish that you shouldn't believe that like a moral argument is just awful and terrible and shouldn't be taken seriously, just, you know, because, you know, somebody has told you that philosophy has moved beyond this point. I mean, I agree with him that, you know, showing that critics of moral arguments still take them seriously establishes that. I'm not advocating for people to, you know, take that approach to moral arguments and just, you know, say laugh it off. But, you know, at the same time, I don't think that does anything to establish the point that moral arguments are good or successful. And to be fair to Gavin, he does say that himself. So I don't know. In some sense, I guess it does raise a question of who this video is made for. Maybe it's just for the person who is like thinking that there's nothing to moral arguments because of sort of atmosphere of that that he sees arising in Christian apologetics. And to that extent, I agree with him. I mean, just because there's an atmosphere that, such and such an argument is ridiculous in, the online Christian apologetics sphere, you shouldn't reject an argument just because of that. An argument should always be judged on its own merits, ultimately. But at the same time, I think when you do that for the moral argument, when you do take it seriously, it just doesn't stand up.
Right. Yeah, I have the exact same reaction to this. If he's responding to people, because I've seen people say stuff like, "Oh, we got to reject the moral argument because contemporary analytic philosophers don't take it seriously at all." Even if we suppose that that's true, who cares if most of them, don't take it seriously? That's not a good reason to not take a view seriously. Hey, a bunch of these people over here, they don't like this argument, so don't even consider it. That's not a good reason to not consider an argument. And if all he's saying is, don't be so quick to abandon it for that reason, that's a bad reason. I'm on the same page. But it's like, okay, well, let's actually judge it on its merits. Okay, kind of sucks. It's not a good argument. So that's consistent with what he's saying, though. I mean, he's very careful to say, like, he's not saying in this, maybe he thinks it's a good argument, but I think his point here is he says, like, I'm not saying the argument's necessarily like a good one or successful, for, like, at least as far as I'm understanding him, for the point he's trying to make here. And that, fair enough.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. We probably don't have to dwell on that anymore.
This is helpful. This is more a video that's more designed to encourage Christians rather than necessarily defeat all the possible objections out there from onlookers. Here's my first suggestion. We need to be more creative and full-orbed in the descriptions we give of morality. The moral argument is such a fascinating sort of subject matter. The moral argument gets its power from deep-seated intuitions in the human heart. Of all the arguments for God, I think the moral argument might be the most visceral and emotional. It's not pulling us way far away from everyday experience into some remote technicality. It's drawing from an intimate awareness deep down that we all feel about good and evil. And I think the best use of moral arguments will tap into the full range of moral experience that we have. Some moral arguments really put the focus on the objectivity of moral values and duties. And that's an understandable and often very effective strategy. But of course, there's more to morality than you might say something like the objectivity of morality is like the skeleton, and then the full ontological quality of morality is like the organ and tissue. So we want to consider the full range of what makes morality significant, including things like moral experience, moral knowledge, the moral status of persons, moral rights, moral freedom, moral transformation, and my personal favorite that I'll end this whole video with is moral hope. Even many of those who are skeptical of the moral argument proper, insofar as it focuses on moral objectivity, someone like Richard Swinburne, is more favorable to arguments from other aspects of morality, like moral knowledge. And in the current literature right now, these evolutionary debunking arguments that come up that concern moral knowledge, in my opinion, are very strong. What they're pointing out is that if our knowledge of morality is reductively explained by our evolutionary history with all its contingent development, it's very difficult to be confident that we have arrived upon the correct moral intuitions. That's not an easy challenge to address. But the broader point I'm just trying to make right now is it's helpful to shine the spotlight on the full arena of moral experience and moral reality and the kind of unique quality and character that it has. Sometimes
So this is the first time I am choosing a stopping point. I mean, I already said a lot of what I wanted to say on this when I talked about the psychology of all of this. One thing I'll say is I 100% agree with him. Like here, he's saying, look, let's not just focus on objectivity. Let's focus on all these other aspects of how we experience morality. Fair enough. I agree with that. I do think, there might be too much of an emphasis on realism and not enough of an emphasis on other aspects of the experience of morality or moral psychology. But I would still reiterate the same point here, which is that these are empirical questions, and for whatever reason, people seem reluctant to actually engage with the empirical literature on this. A lot of this remains in the realm of armchair philosophy and pronouncements made, like people will say stuff like all through human history, people have been moral realists, or all through human history, people have experienced morality this way without a shred of evidence to support that that's true. And I find this deeply puzzling, why people would venture into psychology, but then not engage with the psychology. It's real weird. I don't know if you have thoughts on all that.
Probably less on the psychology aspect of it. I do think he's bringing up an important point here, and that, and this is something he's getting, I believe, from David Baguette, who likes to, really focus in on the phenomenology of like moral experience and in different aspects of morality. A few points I'll make on this is that I do think it's helpful, because I think like the William Lane Craig moral argument, it doesn't, it's not telling you anything informative about like why it is that objective moral facts or obligations or values or duties, I think is how he typically frames it. But anyway, it's not telling you anything specific about why God is needed for these things. It just kind of like packs it all into the syllogism and pulls out the entailments of it, when like all of the interesting stuff isn't asking like why I think that, that first premise of Craig's argument is true. So I do think it's helpful for Baguette and Gavin here to be kind of asking people to actually think about specifically what is it about morality, right, that you are thinking is pointing to God. So I think it's helpful that he's having people think about that. The issue is I don't think you're going to come up with a really clear answer. And what's interesting in my own study is that when you actually read people who have thought about this, they're very often no longer making moral arguments. Or at least they're not making your standard one. So for example, C. Stephen Evans, in his book, God and Moral Obligation, he doesn't actually think that just moral values point to God. He says that it's not true to argue that if God didn't exist, then, there wouldn't be anything to morality. He argues that like you very specifically need God for this one aspect of morality known as moral obligations, which I don't think actually helps him, because to me, that's the most problematic aspect of moral realism, in my opinion, is if you want to introduce stance-independent obligations, because I begin to think that's unintelligible. There are at least ways like I can make the idea of moral values, stance-independent moral values, intelligible to myself. I am not at this time persuaded that such things exist, but like there are ways I can make that intelligible. Other people, like, for example, want to argue from moral knowledge, right? He brings that up. And honestly, I don't see what morality is doing there. Like, I don't think that morality is doing any work there, or moral realism isn't. You could just make an argument. It's basically an argument for God from our ability to like sort of know things that wouldn't be evolutionarily advantageous. And like, you don't have to use morality there. There's all sorts of knowledge you can pack into there. So I don't really see this as being a distinctly moral argument. It's like a particular type of argument from reason, or argument from like specific types of knowledge for God's existence. And I'm actually reasonably sympathetic to some of those arguments. I think there's at least an argument. Like, I haven't done a ton of thinking on this, but there's definitely a conversation to be had about like why it is that we're able to know certain things that maybe wouldn't be easily explicable on sort of a naturalistic evolutionary account of sort of the development of the human psyche. It's just not a moral argument at that point, though. You're just arguing on the basis of something entirely different. And moral knowledge is particularly problematic because I don't think we actually have it. I mean, there's not a good argument that we actually have moral knowledge, in my opinion. It would be much better to, and this might be a disagreement between you and me, Lance, but I think that like there are certain things that can be known a priori, like certain logical principles and things like that, certain maybe abstract mathematical truths, which would, similarly, the same points that you'd be able to make in like a moral knowledge argument, you could make for these things, because it's not clear why we should be able to know certain logical truths or abstract mathematical truths by means of, evolutionary development. So if that's sort of what's doing a lot of the work in your argument, you don't have to bring moral knowledge into it at all. And I think it's much more defensible that we actually, know certain mathematical or logical propositions, whereas that we know moral propositions is just not defensible at all. So those are my thoughts on that section.
Yeah, I'll say a little bit about this before moving on. When it comes to the evolution of human psychology, I'm a bit puzzled when people frame evolution as though, I'm a big proponent of evolution accounting for why humans are the way that we are. But the thing about that is that I see humans as having adapted to the cultural niche. We have adapted to being the sorts of organisms that are really good at not front loading or baking in our behavioral predispositions and all the things that we know how to do, because we instead adapted to be super flexible and to be super responsive to our environments. We adapted to learning. One of my favorite books on this is from Kim Sterelny called The Evolved Apprentice. And the way I look at humans is that humans are these organisms that are really, really, really good at outsourcing their knowledge and thinking to the environment. And that environment includes their predecessors, their parents, their grandparents, the entire cultural history that led up until the moment that they are receiving that instruction. Right now, we've got shoes and cars and technology, and all of that comes from the people that came before us. I don't know how almost any of this stuff works. And so, humans work collectively. We rely extensively on the accumulation, storage, and transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. And so that capacity to flexibly adapt to new environments means that it's not like we have all these genes that have shaped the structure of the human brain to know how to extract resources from the environment, to know how to hunt, to know how to build shelter, to know how to build. There's no genes for making headphones or making glasses or doing almost any of the things that we know how to do. And so one of the things that evolution can do is equip an organism with a psychological predisposition to learn. And it could, that you could imagine the system that is, maybe functionally in some ways kind of like a computer where you could download software and the software comes from your culture. Now, I don't want to push an analogy of human thinking to computers too much, because I think that this is consistent with almost any metaphysics of what the human mind is. But if you have an organism that from a natural selection perspective, it evolved to have this as its adaptation. Hey, learn stuff around you, think about stuff, figure things out. That opens up these massive vistas of conceptual and cognitive possibilities that they don't have to be directly adaptive. All that would have to be adaptive from a natural selection perspective is that you have that ability. So natural selection can say, hey, organisms that have this ability have better reproductive fitness than our conspecifics. And so they tend on average to leave behind more fertile offspring than other people. Okay. Now, does that mean that all of the things that people learn are directly going to be adaptive? No. People can pick up bad software. You wouldn't say computers don't work well just because they can get computer viruses. Their susceptibility to, like, okay, if you go on the internet, you could pick up a computer virus on the internet. Does that mean it's not useful to go on the internet? No. So if you have this learning capacity and you could come to adopt from your culture maladaptive practices, that doesn't mean that you couldn't possibly be a product of natural selection or that the cognitive faculties that you're employing couldn't be a product of natural selection. So what are some of the things people do? Some people opt to get, a vasectomy, or they use birth control. They are opting out, if they do that, for their entire lives and never have children, they're opting out of of evolution. They're not leaving behind direct offspring. They might help family members or something like that. So that actually is still consistent with, kin selection and stuff. But just the general point is people can acquire maladaptive beliefs and attitudes that are not advantageous from a natural selection perspective. As a result, might seem paradoxical, but it's not, of having an adaptive type of cognitive system, this learning-based system. So when I see a lot of people appeal to facts about human cognition and human behavior as reasons to think, oh, evolution can't account for this, they're just wrong. Evolution could account for this. Now, does that mean it must have accounted for this? No. I think it's the best explanation, but I think people often don't appreciate just how powerful of an explanatory tool natural selection actually is. It's quite consistent with a lot of the unique and unusual things that humans engage in. So that was just a point I wanted to make about that, because you mentioned it, and I was like, oh, well, this is a point where I get to make a point I don't often get to make. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, or we should just continue.
No, I think that's a helpful point to make, because it's not, it highlights that it's also not just as clear of it's not as clear cut of a case of like, oh, well, maybe if I can't make the argument from like the objectivity of morality, maybe I can make the argument from moral knowledge. It's not going to be as clear cut as that, for, in part for the reasons you mentioned, because it's not, at least there's going to have to be an argument to be had about why evolution is not capable of doing that. So it's not just like an easy, obvious alternative to a moral argument. There's still plenty of technical argumentation to be had there. There's, of course, the challenge that both of us are going to agree with. It's not clear that we have knowledge of moral realist facts. Neither you or me think that we do. And then I just think the more fundamental point here is it's not even a moral argument at that point. I mean, you're just arguing for particular types of knowledge that humans have. That's not a standard moral argument in any sense.
Yeah, no, and I take your point that, if the idea is there's certain things humans can do, like intellectually or psychologically, that could be hard to explain on a naturalist or evolutionary framework, why single out morality when there's all these other things that are probably better candidates? Morality strikes me as exactly the kind of thing that is much closer to a biological sort of thing. That's like, maybe evolution can explain that. But
and the reason it's being selected is it seems to me, and with all due respect to Gavin, it's being done to say, here's a way we can salvage the moral argument. Because if you take that out, then it's so obvious that you're not talking about a moral argument anymore.
Yeah. But then you have stuff like, logic and mathematics. Mathematics is weird. Like how to, whoa, like what's going on there? I find that a lot more, again, I'm going to take a not necessarily a natural, I'm going to take an empiricist perspective on that. You and I have almost diametrically opposed views on like epistemology and stuff. But like, I think math is tougher to grapple with philosophically, and maybe some of the findings out of science than morality. It doesn't seem like the toughest one to grapple with, morality. So I am a bit puzzled.
And there's going to be much more dire consequences, I think, for someone denying that we have mathematical knowledge than, for denying that we have moral knowledge. So they're just if you want to make that sort of knowledge-based argument for theism, I guess the point is there are just so many better candidates to go with than moral knowledge.
Yeah, although maybe that's just my ignorance of these other fields, because I mostly focus on morality. So I don't know.
Fair enough.
All right, let's keep going. And I think we might want to stop at the halfway point, and then we'll have to do a round two, because we cannot get through this whole video.
Yeah, I was thinking we might have to suggest that, because we're only a third of the way through and almost an hour and 15 minutes into stream.
Yep. Okay, I'm going to start playing this, and I'm going to run a little break. So run and take a little break. So if for whatever reason you want to stop in the 2-3 minutes while I'll be gone, we could just roll it back or something. Is that cool? All right.
Good.
I will be right back, everybody, and we're gonna roll the video.
Sometimes in the literature on this topic, you'll find references to the Anscombe intuition, which is from Elizabeth Anscombe, fascinating person and 20th century figure who debated C.S. Lewis, Roman Catholic philosopher. And David Baggett, drawing from C. Stephen Evans, describes this Anscombe intuition as the idea that moral obligations as experienced have a unique character, and attempts to explain moral obligations must illuminate that special character. And it's this particular character of morality that I think we really need to emphasize. So, for example, Anscombe argued that moral feelings have an inherent kind of authority to them. Moral obligation places itself upon us like a kind of law. Think of what it feels like when you feel really guilty in your conscience about something you've done. I remember I was a little kid, I stole some baseball cards from my brother, and I remember I couldn't sleep that night. I'm confessing my sins all these years later. I've already actually told my brother about that. But that feeling. It's like you feel so guilty. That's a very particular and peculiar kind of emotion. And the law-like binding character of morality calls for some kind of explanation. And this is really important to emphasize, because I think this undercuts a lot of the common objections that we'll get to moral arguments. Sometimes people will reference different meta-ethical theories about why some actions are morally better than others, as though that explained why any action should be moral in the first place. It's harder to do that once we've truly grasped the peculiar nature of morality that needs to be explained. Or another thing that we'll see a lot is a conflation between moral bad and non-moral bad. So critics of the moral argument will often claim that suffering is bad because of its intrinsic character. This is something that Joe Schmid emphasized in his response to me on Swan Sauna's channel on this topic. And Eric Wielenberg also brings this point up using the example of a child who's suffering terrible pain. But I think the danger here is an equivocation on this word bad. David Baggett gives a good response to this. He says, most of us would surely affirm that the child's excruciating suffering is bad, but on reflection, it seems that it's best to characterize it as non-morally bad. There seems...
What? That seems more, people suffering seems morally bad to me. It seems a bit strange.
Yeah, and I think you'd say in no case does it seem morally realist bad, you know, or non-morally realist bad.
Yeah. I mean, just again, like, you know, I make this point like a million times in this channel, but people just do not distinguish normative ethics from meta ethics. Like, hey, people think things are bad, so they're realists. No, people will say that cake was disgusting, or, you know, that pie was delicious. Does that mean they're gastronomic realists? No, like, it's frustrating to have to make that point so often. So I won't belabor the point. And I also won't belabor the, you know, immediately after I started playing this, you know, this supposedly unique character of moral experience. You know, I don't have that experience, and I'm not convinced most or all people do. And there's still a question of where that comes from, to the extent that people report having it. I suspect it's culturally acquired. It's a learned behavior when people report that sort of stuff.
I think the point he was making, or what I took his point to be there, was he was trying to argue from like the specific character of moral obligation. And I guess he was using like guilt as an example of it, which was really weird to me, because typically these people like don't want to, you know, just make it sort of a subjective experience of how you feel, because it's trivially easy to explain that kind of stuff without well, any reference to realism, or certainly to God, because you can, you know, explain why you have feelings of guilt and stuff, due, you know, whether to evolution or to societal factors, or, you know, I think there's certain, you might know more about this than me, but there are certain like types of brain chemicals and things that get released as like a result of certain activities, which will lead to guilty feelings. And so it's just trivially easy to explain that kind of stuff without appealing to theism. I take it he wants to move from, like, say, assuming he can make a argument from a feeling of guilt to that, like, actually tracking a moral obligation, and saying that, like, obligations have this sort of authoritative nature to them. Which, again, I find it very difficult to make sense out of what that stuff's supposed to be. This was like my biggest hang up with moral realism. I fundamentally cannot make intelligible to myself the notion of a stance independent obligation. I cannot do it, and not for lack of trying. So, but let's say that, you know, such things can be made intelligible to someone. I don't see the argument from that to theism. It's usually something like, well, when there's an obligation on you, it you know, it comes from an authority, right? Like, you know, your boss or the government or something. To which I say, yes, but those are not supposed to be moral realist obligations. So if you want to, you know, they're not supposed to be stance independent. So if you want to say that, like, moral obligations are analogous to, you know, the sort of social obligations that we have, you're not arguing for a moral realist theory. Like, the more analogous you make it to social obligations, the more open you're going to become to the claim that this is not a moral realist theory anymore. And the more you distance yourself from those sorts of obligations to make it a moral realist theory, the more we're going to say then it shouldn't be explained in the same way. This was my big objection that I gave in my video to C. Stephen Evans' argument from moral obligation, is I think there's a genuine dilemma here, that you want to say, you know, moral obligations have to come from an authority, because, or like a conscious agent authority, because all of our other obligations do. That's kind of the dilemma I put there for you. Either you're going to make it so similar to social obligations, as, you know, I think Evans does, that you're going to open yourself up to the charge that it's stance dependent. It's not a moral realist theory anymore. Or if you distance yourself from that, then there's no reason to suppose that it has to have the same sort of explanation.
Let's keep going.
Seems to be a need here to disambiguate between moral and non-moral badness. And he bases that distinction between moral bad and non-moral bad on, among other things, William Sorley's observation that moral bad has a personal dimension to it. So changing an example I've given in the past slightly, imagine that you're walking out of your house on a Monday and it snowed recently and some ice slides off right as you're walking out the front door, randomly slides off and hits you on the head and gives you a concussion. And then imagine on Tuesday, you are walking out of your house and your neighbor is waiting and maliciously throws a chunk of ice at you and hits you on the head and gives you a concussion. And the motive he has is malice. He wants to hurt you. Even if the concussion you have on Monday is exactly identical to the concussion you get on Tuesday, these two events are bad in a different sense. The sliding ice on Monday is a non-moral bad. There's no personal guilt involved. The neighbor maliciously attacking you is doing something bad in a different sense. Here they've broken and violated the kind of law-like character of morality. Their different emotions are involved, like indignation and guilt and even shame, and different actions and responses are called for. So the point I'm making is the more we draw attention to the full texture of moral experience, the more we can undermine some of these responses, like the conflation between different meanings of the word bad or different meanings of the word good. Here's a second strategy I think we can consider, and that's using abductive moral arguments. So
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a ton to say about that because I honestly didn't see really what the relevance of like making that sort of distinction was to making a moral argument. I mean, yeah, I can agree that, well, kind of funny. Sometimes I do actually feel indignation in things, even towards like inanimate objects that like I trip on or whatever. You know, I just want to like smack them and break them or whatever, because you just got that that kind of primal reaction to, you know, stubbing your toe or whatever. But I mean, I do take his point. Obviously, there's a difference when, you know, an agent is harming you versus an inanimate object is harming you. I don't see what the distinction has to do with the moral argument. I don't understand what his point was in drawing attention to that distinction, honestly.
I don't know. maybe he'll respond and we could find out. I don't know.
Maybe, yeah. It seemed like a really irrelevant part of the video to me, but maybe I'm missing something.
All right, let's keep going, and maybe this would be the last section that we address. I don't know. There's a couple more sections, but maybe we could just power through and get it all done. I don't know. Let's see.
Okay.
I said I don't know too many times. No, I'm self-conscious. Okay, let's keep going.
Abductive simply means an inference to the best explanation, as opposed to a deductive or inductive argument, which work from premises to a conclusion. So abductive moral arguments are basically saying, here's morality. How do we explain that? Well, God seems to be the best explanation of that. Whereas a deductive moral argument will often proceed more confidently, saying basically, morality proves God in some more definitive sense. And to be clear, I think both kinds of argument could work in different contexts. This is a matter of strategy. But to get at a little bit of how abductive arguments can be helpful just strategically.
Sorry, this is just a point I didn't want to forget. What does he mean when he says he thinks a deductive argument can work in certain contexts? The only context I can think of where a deductive moral argument is going to work, but by work, I mean like that you can get your proponent convinced by, or get your opponent convinced by it, is if they just are like incredibly philosophically like inept and they don't understand this at all and are not like taking any measures to critically think through it. I cannot think of any situation where a deductive moral argument works in the sense that it's a good argument. And it's interesting to me that he's saying that we should use an abductive argument over a deductive one, and yet he says that he thinks in certain contexts a deductive moral argument could work. I would be really curious under like what context he has in mind that he thinks it's going to work. Because the only context I can think of where you'd prefer an abduct or where you would prefer a deductive argument is if you're just trying to sound really confident and you know that your audience or your interlocutor doesn't have the like academic acumen to point out the obvious mistakes in deductive moral arguments. Deductive moral arguments are like, they're terrible. Do not use them. An abductive moral argument, I can see where you're coming from. I agree. If you want to use moral arguments, go that route. I'm just curious why, like, what he's thinking when he says that he thinks there are some contexts where a deductive moral argument would be good.
I'm a bit puzzled at the remark, maybe for different reasons. Why would it be good in some contexts and not others? If an argument like if it's a sound argument, it's a sound argument. So part of this maybe hinges on what he means by the argument's working. Did he use the term work, or are we using that term?
I thought he used that term. You can roll it back if you want.
Yeah, let's roll it back. I want to be clear.
Both kinds of argument could work in different contexts.
Yeah, he does say that. Yeah. So like I'm just curious what he means by work. So, one goal you might have when presenting arguments is to like make a strong case for position, but there's other aspects of argumentation, which is like persuasion. Is this argument going to persuade your interlocutors? And another might be something like an educational aspect of, I wouldn't necessarily present a super complicated argument to people that would just scratch their heads and not know what I'm talking about. And so one argument may work better in one case, another may work better in another case for pedagogical purposes or persuasive purposes. But I don't know what he means by work here.
That is actually that's probably the better question to ask. But all right, we can move on. I didn't want to miss that.
Yeah.
But to get at a little bit of how abductive arguments can be helpful in just strategically, in depending on the conversation you're navigating, I can share a little bit about this from my own angle. In 2023, already crazily coming up on 2 years ago, I put out this video on the moral argument. And the basic goal was I was trying to survey one particular way that moral realism is often grounded in non-theistic views out in the literature. And what I was trying to point out is that many of these seem very explanatorily brute, which just means many of these accounts of morality don't go much further than saying, well, that's just the way it is. They either boil down to that or they're not much further than that. Some are saying basically moral facts come from nowhere and nothing grounds them. There is nothing further beyond love and justice to make them good. They just are. Sometimes we're told that it can be a fitting end to the explanatory enterprise to say it just is what it is. That's of its essence. And in the video, I gave a fuller case there, but I was just observing that this feels a little underwhelming, especially in relation to how.
Gotta say, I 100% agree with him. This stuff about that's just the way it is. It's just a brute fact. It's just primitive. I don't know about, maybe we have different attitudes about this stuff, but I have always found this stuff really, really empty and unconvincing.
So 2 points on that from me is that I'm a little more willing to just say stuff is brute. Having bruteness doesn't bother me at all in my ontology. But the more salient point is that what is the advantage here? As we play through this next section, pay attention to what he says. See if he actually avoids the bruteness, right? Because he's going to try to say, if I remember correctly, sorry, it's been a few days since I watched this video while I should say I listened to it as I was driving home from work. But as I remember, he is going to try to say that like God is a simpler explanation or something because God is one thing. But really, no. If he wants to go with Robert Adams' account of how God explains morality is that there are certain resemblance relations which obtain between human actions and certain facts contained within, the divine nature. And it's in virtue of that resemblance relation that, an act can be considered good or bad. All right, well, these facts in God's nature, I mean, do we have some further explanation for those? Right? Why is God this way? Why does God have these particular facts that are being resembled in his nature? It's going to be just as brute. So we've got just as many brute facts here as, are going to be in any theory he's objecting to. So kind of regardless of whether or not you find, appeal to brute facts to be a compelling or persuasive account, my contention is going to be they exist to the exact same degree in the theory that Adams is putting forward, and that I think that Gavin here is accepting. That's how I would respond.
All right, let's keep going. I want to see if we could get through it. Maybe we won't. That's okay. If you got to stop, let me know. If I got to go, I'll let you know.
Okay.
Into how confidently some of these theories are appealed to, because while it's true that explanation has to stop somewhere, that's not a reason to cut off the search at a superficial point. We want to press through to a really satisfying explanation. And William Lane Craig addresses this by comparing moral theory to mathematical theory. He says, despite the broadly logical necessity and self-evidence of arithmetic truths, and he gives some example, mathematicians would never be content with a theory that simply postulates an infinite blizzard of such truths. Rather, they seek a theory in which such truths may be derived from explanatory prior axioms. And similarly, in morality, we want to have some kind of overarching theory that has coherence and so forth. And so the way the discussion usually goes here is these non-theistic explanations for objective morality will usually just counter by saying, well, yeah, God is the exact same way. We saw that a little bit already in the Wenberg quote. They'll basically say, yeah, everybody has bruteness. We posit bruteness here, you posit bruteness there. Nobody can sort of, just go on explaining forever. The explanation has to stop at some point. And so then you're at that point in the discussion, you're sort of in a standoff about which is the better place for bruteness. And at this juncture, I think basically in conversations, it's often helpful to just reason abductively. This kind of takes a little bit of the pressure off of what you have to accomplish. And we can basically just ask, well, what's the least brute option? What's the best and most satisfying explanation for reality as a whole? And in particular, this peculiar arena we call morality. And we can point out that with God as the ultimate sort of backstop of explanation, we have a singular, concrete, personal agent who is held to be uncaused and infinite. And this seems superior than positing an array of multiple abstract truths.
Notice the
Here's
shift.
how Adam Johnson puts it.
Shift there. So the shift is he's trying to say, no, we're just grounding it in one thing. We're just grounding it in God. It's not really the case when you get into the details of how Adam's theory works. You're saying that various things are right or wrong because they're resembling these various aspects of God's nature. And we can say, why is God's nature that way? We're not going to get a deeper explanation for that. So these facts are just as brute on the theistic hypothesis as they are on Wenberg's. It's not the case that you're appealing to fewer things if you're going to go with Adam's theory, which is what Ortlund seems to want to do. And also, I'd also want to say his point about what's more satisfying. That seems so subjective to me. I mean, is that just like a statement of like your own psychological assessment of how, whether it raises more questions for you or whatever? I mean, I don't see why that would tell you anything about the superiority of an explanation. Satisfying to me seems like a completely subjective criteria.
Yeah, I agree with the latter point. I'll also make another point. If someone's really concerned with explanatory, if someone's really concerned with explanatory virtues like simplicity, there's something to be said for anti-realism.
Yes.
We don't have to posit that there are stance-independent moral facts. And, typically the sorts of things that anti-realists think that there are, like subjective attitudes and emotions and, feelings about what's right or wrong and all that sort of stuff. Those all exist in the world of the realist anyway. They just don't think that that's what morality reduces to. So, it's not like we're positing an alternative set of irreducible or brute facts that the realist doesn't have access to. For us anti-realists, I'm not including you in that. I'm an anti-realist. I know you're not. But basically just the point here is if you're looking for parsimony or simplicity or something like that, that's a feather in the cap for anti-realists. We at least have that, and shouldn't that count for something?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I guess I was saying, let's suppose we had some independent evidence or whatever that moral realism were true, and so we're taking moral realism as a granted, and we're just focusing on, is theism the better hypothesis here? Ortlund's argument, as I understand it, is, well, look, it's simpler because we're positing one thing. And I'm pushing back on that. Like, no, you're positing just as many brute entities as somebody like Wheelerberg. But yes, I agree. That's a good point. If you're going to take simplicity really seriously, that's going to actually create some more fundamental problems for the whole moral realist premise. It's interesting how we keep coming back to that one.
Yeah.
That God seems to fit the bill better as the ultimate ontological stopping point that needs no explanation because he, as commonly understood by theists, is an infinite, necessary, concrete, and most importantly, causal being. Now he fleshes out the...
I just want to make a quick point about this. Just God seems to fit the bill better. Seems to who? According to what standard? I mean, this is making a move that I find really objectionable when people do this. Not that I'm like offended, I'm not angry, but just people say something seems to be the case without appreciating, I think, at least not explicitly where they do so, that what seems to be a certain way to somebody, one person may not seem that way to somebody else. It's not clear to me. Does it seem this way to you?
So I agree with the point you're making there. I do think Johnson here is doing a little more. He's saying it seems this way, and then he says because God is understood by theists. But look at the actual criteria he's positing. Because he is infinite and necessary. All right, if we're comparing theism to Platonism, you got that's an exact wash there. So like saying it's infinite and necessary, those aren't advantages for theism. The Platonist has the same thing. He's concrete. Okay, in Platonism they're abstract, but why would being and he says most importantly causal, but to be causal just is to be concrete. To be concrete means you can stand in causal relations. So I think he's doing a bit of a double count there. And so then the question is, why is it a better explanation for morality that it's sourced in something that can stand in causal relations versus that it's something that's abstract? These are the sorts of issues I was highlighting with Johnson's book before. He just lists out these things like, look, these are advantages of a theistic theory. Sorry, why? Why is it a better explanation of morality that you're locating it in something that's causal? I don't see at all why that's supposed to make it a better explanation.
The argument for that. I'm not seeking to fully make a defense of this claim for the critic so much as to try to encourage Christians to consider this kind of approach. It's in general, it's less helpful. In fact, I would just encourage us to not say things like atheists have no explanation for morality and things like this. That's the kind of thing I think we need to push away from. Or if somebody says, all atheists are moral nihilists or something like that, we want to recognize not all atheists are naturalists, for example, meaning some people are atheists. They don't believe in God or gods, but that doesn't mean they only believe in physical reality. And so we want to sort of honor each different option and look at all the different views that are out there. And sometimes reasoning abductively can be a really effective way to do that. Really what we want to get into here is what are the specific reasons why theism has basically a more elegant way of accounting for metaethics. And we have the privilege of suggesting that question. It really is. I mean,
yeah, by the way, that what you laid out there, that's like the critical question to me in a moral argument. Is it's a very simple question. Why is theism the better explanation than any hypothetical the atheist could give? I don't think the explanation he's going to give is very good. I do like that he's centering the focus on that question, though, because I don't think enough Christian apologists have grasped that is the question you need to answer in an abductive moral argument.
Yeah, and also the explicit recognition of that space between naturalism and physicalism and theism. So, double thumbs up for that.
I mean, I think Robert Adams' book is a great example of that. Third strategy is offer moral hope. Of all the qualities of morality that are helpful to focus on right now, I think moral hope is especially poignant. And the reason is very simple. This is an extension from the first point a little bit, talking about the full nature of morality. But I just feel this is very relevant to the world right now because there is so much despair. Many people feel overwhelmed by the evil of the world, and they may be searching for moral hope. And let's not forget that what we have to offer to people in the gospel of Jesus Christ is good news. The gospel is good news for every area of life, but that includes the moral realm because it offers moral hope. The gospel says basically good is going to defeat evil in the end. That's one of the things the gospel teaches us. And we want to present this to people in such a way that a good person should at least want this to be true. So, to give an example of what this might look like, there are lots of people around us right now who are secular people who don't have any belief in the supernatural, and yet they're not quite willing to part ways with the intuition that love and justice really matter. Love and justice have some kind of, even many will want to say they have some kind of transcendent quality to them. Okay. They may have not thought through how they think about that, but many people still believe that, even if they've discarded belief in God and the supernatural. But within the confines of a secular worldview, it's very hard to see how you're going to keep a transcendent love and justice. Love and our perception and our experience of love and justice are going to be reductively explained, if you're a naturalist, by the basically by evolutionary psychology. These are the byproducts of what helped our animal ancestors survive. They have no objective.
Just as a side note, byproducts, they wouldn't be byproducts. They could, if they're adaptive, they would be products. I don't know why they say byproduct. This is something I addressed in the previous video. When people talk about byproducts, typically from an evolutionary point of view, you would talk about various traits or phenotypes being like, I don't know if you'd say a product of natural selection. I mean, I guess you could, but I would call them adaptation. So that it would be the thing that was selected for. And then there could be traits that or characteristics that an organism exhibits that are byproducts. So they weren't directly selected for, but they come along for the ride. So there could be like the color of your blood doesn't have to be selected for. It could be that the reason your blood is a particular color is because the biochemistry associated with whatever facilitates like oxygenation of the blood or whatever. That's what's adaptive, and it's not the color itself that's adaptive. So that's typically what's meant by byproduct. I'm just being a little nitpicky, though.
Well, and one other thing maybe to flag there is even though he has warned about this kind of binary, it seems like he's almost falling into it a little bit again here by suggesting that the only other explanation you could give for like love and justice and things being transcendent, the only alternative to God is that they're going to have to be explained through like this naturalistic evolutionary perspective. And as he himself has pointed out, and as we've pointed out throughout this stream, that's just a false point.
Yep. Yeah.
Reference in the non-biological world, and they will have no final significance or resolution or something like that. Charles Taylor talks about this in his book, A Secular Age, amazing book if you haven't read it. And he calls areas like these the unquiet frontiers of modernity, where secularism is advancing and yet it has some anxieties and it's still trying to work a few things out. To put it simply, many secular people still live with moral hopes that don't quite make sense anymore in their worldview. I'm not saying that for every secular person, but this is commonly the case. And because on the one hand, there's this sense that love and justice have to have some kind of final and even transcendent significance. On the other hand, it's very hard to see how you can maintain that. And a lot of people haven't thought that through. And so this just gives us a chance to offer an invitation and say, hey, you know how movies always have almost every time good triumphing over evil? Why is that so deep in the human heart? Is that just a product of our evolutionary psychology? Or is this instinctive longing for good to achieve a kind of lasting happy victory over evil? Is it more than just the byproduct of our survival mechanisms? Maybe there's something more. Maybe that's actually a clue about the ultimate reality. And of course, in the gospel, we believe this is true. This is such good news. This is such a happy message to share with people. If Jesus rose from the dead, we get to tell them that there will be a final and complete victory of good over evil. I don't know why I always think of this movie, but I love the movie X-Men Days of Future Past. Came out in 2014, one of the best X-Men movies. I just love the scene where Wolverine wakes up, spoiler alert, sorry about this, after time has been reset and all is well again. He's walking around Professor X's mansion, and there's this kind of bright aura about everything. That's one example of hundreds we could give. You could mention your favorite movie of the way a happy ending feels, right? When it's like, it just, at the end of a movie, when it comes to resolution, there's a particular emotional experience involved with that. And as followers of Jesus, we get to tell people that because Jesus rose from the dead, that is actually a tiny little glimmer of what's going to happen one day forever. that you really could.
I just got to say, I don't know where he's going with this. I didn't watch this far into the video, but what does this have to do with moral realism?
I was going to say, I feel like this is the part where we just have kind of like abandoned the moral argument, and he's just kind of like low-key preaching a little bit. And it's not that that's a bad thing. It's that I don't see what it has to do with the moral argument. I mean, I agree that like this is something actually you and me have talked about a little bit privately, is that kind of one of the things I enjoy about kind of being a Christian and about Christianity is that it does terminate in like a happy ending, right? There's like kind of a story to Christianity, and like I'm kind of a part of it, and it leads to a happy ending. And like, yeah, I like that, and that does lead to some degree of hope in my life. And I mean, Gavin is highlighting that here, but that's a perk of that's like a perk of the Christian perspective. It's not a reason to think that it's true, and I'm not saying he thinks that it is necessarily. It's very bizarre, this section of the video, to me, because it seems so completely unrelated to the moral argument.
Yeah, I'm a little puzzled at this because, there's on the one hand, you could make sort of philosophical or intellectual arguments for the existence of God or for Christianity. And then on the other, there's sermons, there's touching people emotionally, there's bringing people together. That I would imagine, I'm not a Christian, but I was a Christian. I'm sure some Christians will say, you were never a Christian if you're not a Christian now. Whatever, fine. Then I was what I thought was a Christian. Whatever you want to call it, I don't care. But I went to sermons, and some of those sermons were awesome. They were moving, and they made you feel something, and they can be transformative. Now, that doesn't mean I heard someone say some incredible things and it totally changed my life on the spot forever, but they have an impact on you, and that's important. And it's not like sometimes I worry with like Christian apologetics and Christianity entangling itself with philosophy that I don't know if I worry about this, but I think this are Christians going to, in the apologetics community, turn Christianity into this cold, dead intellectual enterprise and forget about all the other stuff that's important and arguably more important. And maybe this is an indication that no, he hasn't forgotten that, and that this stuff is important too. Again, perhaps more important. I don't know. I'm not going to speak for Christians, but when you shove the two together, like, is it a sermon or is it a philosophical argument? Maybe those should be kept to separate videos. Because I'm not seeing the intellectual relevance of this. I'm not seeing how you could leverage the remarks being made here for some philosophical purpose, even if I can, even I, as like a very much an atheist, can resonate with the idea of, yeah, some hope would be nice. I would like some hope. We're looking at a world with all these, environmental problems and war and the fact that it wouldn't matter what age we were born into, people die. If something offers hope, I'm all for that. That sounds good, but is that a reason to think it's true?
Yeah, no. Yeah, I think we would all hold very different beliefs if we thought that there was like any sort of connection between desirability and truth. I think this probably just gives us a little bit of some insight into kind of who Gavin is as a person. And with all due respect to him, as I said, I do like Gavin. I like his approach to these things, but I do think in his heart he's more of a preacher, someone who wants to minister to the people of God than he is an apologist. And so I think he's someone who very much like sees apologetics as being in the service of the God, which I mean, to an extent, obviously I do as well. But I think it's very like consciously a focus of his to see that like apologetics is supporting the gospel. And so I think this was sort of where he's bringing that more pastoral approach to the video at the end. I don't like to do that in my videos, not because I don't think that there's value in preaching the gospel, but one, most people have heard it. Most people, who are going to be into like apologetic material are going to generally know what the gospel is. And so it just kind of makes you come off as like a preachy, person who's in this more because you're trying to convert people than because like you are actually trying to like grapple with the, philosophical issues. That's why like I don't tend to end my videos with a little sermonette, because I just think it gives off maybe the word is kind of like a hokey, corny vibe. That's why I don't do it in my videos. It tends to distract from the intellectual rigor of the video. So yeah, that's kind of why I don't encourage Christian apologists to necessarily have to tack the sermonette onto the end of the video.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is a bit of a digression, but it's, I've seen quite a bit of, and I'm not talking about the video here, but preachers and Christians giving sermons where there is this hokey, corny vibe to it. And that's just, I guess as both a Christian and now an atheist, I would just cringe deeply at some of that. But that has got to be a difficult line for a pastor or someone that preaches the gospel to walk, to not shift in to the hokey, cheesy, corny stuff that's really off-putting, but to nevertheless maintain an emotional resonance to it and have it actually be impactful. I can't remember the name of the pastors that I had. It's so vague, but I remember there was one in particular that would give these talks that were awesome. Like you felt good when you left. Maybe sometimes you felt a little bad when you left, but you felt something. They were really effective. Now I was very young, but yeah, I don't remember them being cheesy. Maybe I'd listen now and I'd roll my eyes, but that I don't know how Christian apologists navigate that space. I would be very willing to bet, especially that there would be empirical research to support this, that there are contexts in which attempts at preaching to people backfire and actually make them more antagonistic and more closed off because the context in which you're doing it would be inappropriate. I'll give one example. If I was at a close family member's funeral and someone started trying to preach at me, I would get pissed off. I would be like, this is not the time. So maybe there would be contexts where I'd be like, look, don't try to take advantage of my emotional vulnerability. That would be the sort of thing where I would get upset about it. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or
no, yeah,
because I'm digressing a lot.
I do agree with that. And it kind of is actually an interesting point that you raised. I hadn't really considered that, like from someone who is a preacher and is like used to preaching, actually, that it might be very difficult to detach that from the work of apologetics. I'm not a preacher. Like I have preached before at the request of, pastors in different churches that I've been in, but like I am not a preacher. So maybe in some sense it is actually easier for me to like leave the preachy parts out of my apologetic presentations. But yeah, I had not considered it. And yeah, there are definitely times where it's best to not do a gospel like I'm trying not to get in trouble here too much. Like if someone is like, you sense that a person is like, they want it, like they are ready for it, then, absolutely like do that. But like most people are not like 24/7 wanting to hear a sermon, are not like, and there are going to be contexts like one you mentioned where it can actually be more detrimental to try to put something preachy into it. I don't think that Gavin's video here is necessarily an example of that. And he's not even like full on preaching here. It's just, it feels a little preachy, this part of the video.
Yeah, but not in a way where it comes off to me as particularly bad.
It's not manipulative emotionally.
No, not at all. No. So and also I do like the reference to like a real world thing that people could like X-Men, and that scene totally did have the vibe he's talking about with that kind of golden light in the back. Yeah. So sure. Okay, so we're moving on to the last section. I could see from the little point here. So if this last section doesn't seem like something that's especially relevant for us to review, we might be able to wrap up in the next few minutes. Okay. Otherwise, we might have to get all the way to the end. But I'm able to finish this up, so I think we should if we can. Are you cool with finishing this?
Yep, I'm good.
All right, cool. And yeah, it looks like most of our audience isn't really throwing a lot of questions at us. So we just have to get through this last stretch. So let's do it.
Okay.
Couldn't have something happier and more wonderful than the gospel. And we want to make arguments that it's true, but we also want to just hold it out before people and say, look at the hope that this gives. It hit at every different level of the human heart and mind and so forth. All right, wrapping up. Let me give an example of what I see as a creative use of morality to point toward God and certainly to puncture a more like materialist worldview. And this comes from a novel, my favorite novel of all time, or maybe second favorite, and that's That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis. The character Mark is imprisoned in this story. I'll just explain this to finish off. I think you'll find it interesting. He's imprisoned and he's tortured, but it's not physical torture, it's psychological torture. He's placed in a room where the architecture and the doorway are just a little bit out of proportion, but just barely. There's dots on the ceiling and on the floor that just quite don't, they almost align, but they don't quite. And the shape and features of the room are designed to disturb the mind. And they offer the impression of a purpose or pattern, but then continually frustrate that impression. There's also paintings throughout the room. Some of them are grotesque and bizarre. Others seem normal at first, but then when you examine them more closely, there's little oddities. Like there's a painting of the Last Supper, but there's a lot of beetles under the floor. And there's a lot of scriptural themes in the paintings. And the effect that it has upon him, the weirdness of the room, gives him this disturbing feeling of evil. Something like if you're watching a horror movie and there's a particularly gross or bizarre scene and it kind of freaks you out a little bit. That's the effect this has on Mark. And he says that he feels to have come into contact with a deeper kind of evil than he'd previously known. Long ago, Mark had read somewhere of things of that extreme evil which seem innocent to the uninitiate, but had wondered what sort of things they might be. Now he felt he knew. And the purpose, by the way, of his captors who put him in this room, this prison, I call it the crooked room, is a kind of psychological conditioning by which they're trying to get him into what they call objectivity, which, to cut to the chase, basically involves a denial of any kind of objective moral realm. But staying in that room has the opposite effect on Mark. Quote, the built and painted perversity of this room had the effect of making him aware, as he'd never been aware before, of this room's opposite. As the desert first teaches men to love water, or as absence first reveals affection, there rose up against this background of the sour and the crooked some kind of vision of the sweet and the straight. Something else, something he vaguely called the normal, apparently existed. He had never thought about it before, but there it was, solid, massive, with a shape of its own, almost like something you could teach. It was all mixed up with Jane and fried eggs and soap and sunlight and the rooks cawing at Cure Hardy and the thought that somewhere outside daylight was going on at that moment. He was not thinking in moral terms at all, or else, what is much the same thing, he was having his first deeply moral experience. 3 observations about this passage. First, it's interesting that Mark doesn't consciously think in moral terms when he has this moral experience. He doesn't call it morality. He doesn't call it goodness. He just calls it the normal. And related to that, it comes to him in aesthetic categories through art. Okay. So through the architecture, the ugliness of the paintings, and then he associates goodness with things like daylight and fried eggs and soap and things like this. And all of this kind of draws to mind this richer, more complicated vision of what goodness is. Second thing, it's interesting that Mark doesn't have this. C.S. Lewis says this is his first moral experience. And he doesn't have it until he's confronted with real evil. Someone might relate to this if they've ever like been just going through their life and all of a sudden they see something truly demonic. And you're kind of like, oh, good and evil are richer categories than I realized, right? The realm of the conscience almost seems to lie latent within Mark, and then it sort of awakened in this particular experience. And this suggests that there may be a kind of experiential quality to the revelatory nature of morality, which is something we need to keep in mind in our arguments. People might experience the argument differently based upon where they're coming from. Third, the robustness and objectivity of moral goodness is emphasized here. It's called solid and massive and with a shape of its own. It's something external to Mark. And this aspect of the normal is further drawn out because as Mark is basically, the way he survives the torture is from this. It says, day by day, as the process went on, the idea of the straight or the normal grew stronger and more solid in his mind till it had become a kind of mountain. He had never known what an idea meant. He had always thought till now that they were things inside one's own head, but now when his head was continually attacked and often completely filled with the clinging corruption of the training, this idea towered above him, something which obviously existed quite independently of himself and had hard rock surfaces which would not give, surfaces he could cling to. The comparison here to a mountain and the references to hard surfaces that you can cling to emphasizes the practical effect of an objective morality. An objective morality is not simply out there to do nothing. It's not just an empty thought. It's something that can save you when you're under this kind of torture, right? And this is what ultimately saves Mark. I hope you can feel the effect that this depiction of morality can have upon the reader, and just the sense of, I'll use the word again, enchantment that it draws you into. Because that's what I think the gospel does. And the moral argument is one entry point into the larger questions about God. And I think God is enchanting. And I think Jesus, who is the way to God, and to know Jesus is utterly enchanting beyond anything we can possibly fathom. And all I know to do to use moral arguments like this to try to advance the gospel is to try to emphasize the full enchanting nature of it. And when you get a passage like that from C.S. Lewis, boy, he does it better than probably any of us could. All right, thanks for watching, everybody. Let me know.
Okay, so that's it.
Did you follow any of that last part?
No, I didn't get anything out of that. And, one thing I did get, because I never read C.S. Lewis, just from the brief passages, I read them as they were coming up on the screen. Looks like good writing. So I can imagine it being pretty impactful in context. But outside of the context of having read the book, it didn't resonate with me, which, because I've read books that have some kind of impact on me, like 1984. Like I remember reading that cover to cover in like one day. I just couldn't stop reading it, and that hit me. But I can imagine someone taking some random passage out of it, and that sounds good when you're reading it in the text, like when you built up to that point. But then just kind of seeing it without the context, it just doesn't hit. So none of that landed with me. It all struck me as rather obscure. What did you think?
Yeah, same. I kind of went into like, maybe this is just because I've got the sort of mind that like, and perhaps some of it's because I'm just prepared for this and this sort of video. I like, neat logical syllogisms that I can follow. And this just looked like, prose, like when I start getting like flowery prose like that, which, Lewis is good at that. He is a good writer. It just, to me, I check out. Like I enter into like this kind of haze. My eyes just kind of glass over, and I'm like, what are we doing here? I'm not tracking an argument here at all. I don't know that he was necessarily trying to do that either. It seems like he was trying to give you some kind of emotional, I guess in his words, an enchanting hit there at the end of the video, so that you, I guess, are supposed to be gripped by the reality of morality or something like that. It didn't land with me. And maybe that's just because I got a weird psychological disposition or something, but I felt like it was not having the intended effect on me that Gavin wanted it to have.
Yeah, but we might be self-selected into a highly psychologically unusual group of people that we care about like syllogisms and stuff. I don't think most people are that drawn to them, which isn't to put down other people's approaches to things. At times I feel like I have a pathological demand for things being framed and structured in argumentative ways, when I wish I could absorb like the emotional aspects of things in a more organic and natural way. So there's actually a lot of respects in which I envy other people and feel like there's things I'm missing out on. So maybe we're just weird. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think there is probably something to what you said there. But on the other hand, isn't this video kind of like supposed to? I feel like this kind of approach can be counterproductive for who I feel like the audience is supposed to be. Ostensibly, the argument or the video is supposed to be directed to people like me, or people who are sort of on the path to becoming what I have become, which is a Christian apologist that doesn't use the moral argument. And generally speaking, I feel like that's going to be the more sort of tough-minded person. And so, and maybe I'm just drawing from myself here, but maybe like that sort of more flowery approach at the end is, for all that we could say about it that's positive, is, I don't know, maybe that's not the best sort of approach to use for the kind of people I feel like this video is being directed towards. I don't know. That's just, those are some of my thoughts on that last segment of the video.
Maybe people that take a more intellectual or philosophical approach to Christianity maybe it's important to remind them that's not the only approach, and that might not be the only effective approach to take when talking to others.
That I think that could be helpful, but I feel like maybe you don't have that in a context of here's like why you shouldn't abandon the moral argument, because it seems like it's trying to. I didn't take that at all to be the message of the video. It didn't seem like it was a warning against over intellectualization, and there is certainly something to be said for that. I mean, it is too easy to fall into that and to kind of not appreciate the more emotionally fulfilling aspects of the Christian faith. I mean, I know about that struggle firsthand. I guess I just didn't feel like that was the point of the video.
Maybe not trying to still ban it. I also do try to say, or at least I'm making an effort to try to say good things. I think I said a couple things there. I think I have to actively counteract my tendency to want to systematically shred everything I encounter. So I'm trying to work against that. And, it's good to have videos like this where I don't feel that the video, like the main point, I think the main point I took from the video was something like, listen, the main point I took from the video is something like, listen, it's become this thing where a lot of Christians are afraid of appealing to the moral argument because they're basically told this is a silly and ridiculous argument. Philosophers don't take it seriously. And, they shouldn't abandon an argument just because people try to engage in, I got this term from Nathan Orman, Digital Gnosis, narrative control. We shouldn't allow narrative control. People's just saying this view is dead or this view is silly, as that alone to be a reason to stop considering something. Consider it on its own merits. I wish that was made more apparent. Like that's what I'm trying to say in this video. But he ended on a note that seems to have digressed from that. And if he had reinforced that at the end, I think this would have been a stronger video. But that message was in there. And I actually agree with the message, just straightforwardly. We should not allow our positions on things to be held on the basis of being coerced or strong-armed by others, but by what amounts to saying, hey, this view isn't popular, so don't hold it. I really don't like that attitude when it comes into things. And I think that is affecting how people are viewing the moral argument. And I don't like the moral argument, but I don't want the moral argument to go away just because we say, yeah, we all agree it's stupid, so stop talking about it. That's not how we should engage in philosophy.
Yeah, maybe then we could say then the point of this video is that theists should abandon the moral argument, but Gavin is right. They shouldn't do it because of, as you say, narrative control, because there's this increasing perception that it's a bad argument. That should maybe motivate theists who are attracted to this argument to look into it a little bit. And then what I think they will find is that it does not stand up. It's not a good argument. I don't think there are any good variations on it. And just a lot of the variations, even ones that Gavin was considering, are they're stronger if you don't make the moral arguments anymore. And a lot of times we're just not talking about a moral argument anymore. So those are a lot of the pitfalls. But look, I do appreciate Gavin putting this out there. He's getting, I hope, at least Christians to think about this argument. He is warning them away from a lot of the overly simplistic, deductive William Lane Craig type arguments. I do appreciate that. I would not oppose the moral argument nearly as strongly as I do if most theists were presenting it in, a more philosophically self-conscious, abductive, modest way. I would not oppose this argument nearly as strongly as I do. What I hate about it is the overconfidence with which it is presented by people who have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. That's what irritates me about the moral argument. It's presented so much like this is like an absolute death knell to atheism. And usually the person doing so, wants to say atheists just can't account for morality and has never made any effort whatsoever to see how an atheist, might do it. That's why it irks me so much. It's the way it's presented, as well as kind of the sense of entitlement that people who are presenting it seem to have.
Yeah, can't say I disagree with any of that. I think that's a good place to wrap up. So I could throw a link to your channel in the description after this, but I'll do all the standard stuff. Like the video, subscribe to all that stuff, everybody. I'll have the end of the video playing, or clip, or whatever it's called. But again, thanks for coming onto the channel. This for your second round, and we managed to get through the whole video, and it didn't take 3 or 4 hours. That's nice. So thanks for being here. I really appreciated your insights. I thought this was one of the better instances where I'm reviewing something with another person, because a lot of times they and I have pretty much the same things to say, and I think we offered two, in some cases, very different takes on things, and I think hopefully that'll be cool for audiences.
Well, yeah, thanks for having me. Glad I wasn't too terrible of a guest to have on. And yes, I think it's helpful that we, in some ways, have very different philosophical positions, and yet have come to a lot of the same places. But when it comes to the application of the similarities that we've come to on sort of moral issues, because we come to them from different places, those also go out in different ways when we're talking about something like the moral argument. So yes, I appreciated the insights that you were bringing, because some of it was even stuff I hadn't thought of with respect to how problematic moral arguments are.
Cool. All right. Well, everybody, take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye.